Hey everybody, Jake here with TrendSpider to go over a weekend overview and a look at some case studies from earlier in the week. So if you haven't seen the video earlier this week, make sure to check that one out before watching this one because there's a lot of cool things that we touched on, and then this is kind of a follow-up. So starting with SPY, we've got the daily versus the weekly chart. On the daily chart, you can see a few different things here. We've got the anchored volume profile or volume by price starting from this February 19th reversal point here. So notice here, we're in this big uptrend. This was the top. So that's why we're starting the volume profile here, because we want to see what's the status quo kind of changes here. So we want to see where people are holding since this point, and we can see that we pretty much caught a bid right at this break-even zone. You can also call this the point of control, but it's essentially just saying most people that are holding shares from this 340 down to 219 area, a majority of the shares are pretty much holding right at this zone. So at this zone, most people are break even. Supply dries up, demand starts to increase, or demand doesn't even have to increase. Supply just has to dry up because people aren't selling for a profit. And then you've got your change in price here. So clearly we had a little bit of a bounce. That doesn't mean it will continue next week. We are at a very kind of long-term resistance dash support area, as you can see here on the weekly. This area, I colored it blue because it's essentially just a neutral area. It's been resistance here, it's been support here, and now it's been, and it was even support here. If you look here, we initially had a bounce off this zone, and then we even tried to retest this area before moving down, and then you have this area acting as resistance once again. So the question is, we are at this point in time where you do need to take out the longer term chart to see some of this, whereas the daily isn't necessarily going to show you everything. So if we do turn on the gap snake, you can see that we have gaps not only below, but we have gaps above as well. On SPY, it's a little harder to see. You can see that this is the gap right here that the gap snake's picking up right around 298. And then we also, have a couple other ones that haven't fully filled on the Qs, and even IWM as well, which we'll go over. So this is SPY. You can see that we did get that bounce this week. This will be a crucial area to see if this area breaks here around 293, 294. This is kind of your horizontal resistance right here. So anywhere between this anchored VWAP from this reversal candle here, from this pullback, and between this horizontal level is really going to be just kind of chop until you break out through this area to the upside or this area to the downside. But notice once again, we have a lot of people holding here, which generally will act as a base for price. And we'll go over a couple examples of that into the rest of the video. Going into the Qs, you can see here that we do have, you can't make this up. Literally, this was perfect resistance a couple times here, right here, and then we failed to break through it. The raindrop did show volume above this line on this candle, but it did act as an area of kind of where sellers started to come in. Now, once we tried to fill this gap above, we pulled back right down to this resistance trend line, and you can see the same thing. Notice we had a lot of people holding in this area. So as the price gets back into this zone, supply dries up because people can't take profits because they don't have any anymore. So that's where the supply and demand really comes in. So make sure to check out the video on the supply and demand curves, and I will post that in the comment section below so you guys can check that out. I'll just have to remember. Going on the weekly here, I'm kind of using the fibs just because at this point, we could turn on the gap snake. So we can see that the gap still hasn't fully filled. But other than that, there's nothing really to use. You don't have the anchored VWAP. The anchored VWAP is way down here. The volume profile we could use, but we already are using it on the daily. So we're getting that picture here. So for me, the main things that I'm looking at, and this is simply me as a personal trader, everyone's going to use this platform differently. But for me, I'm using the gap snake because this is the only area of of resistance above, not resistance, but this is the only area for people to have a target above as possible resistance is when this gap fills. So that is kind of a boring overview of the Qs, but I gotta admit it's kind of in this weird spot. Do we have one of these guys where it doesn't look that great, but all of a sudden we gap up and then kind of continue to melt up to all-time highs? That would be something a lot of people would not want. So naturally the market will likely give that to them. But that doesn't mean the market's going to continue up. It's one of those things where, as we always talk about, this is a probability thing. You need to know what your downside is. You need to know what your upside is. You can't be biased and say, well, I'm only looking at upside resistance or upside targets. Well, what about if the price breaks down? Are you just going to continue to hold? Is there any downside targets you have to exit? So technical analysis is one part of the trading process. You also have to have a plan of when are you going to get out? Can you even stomach your downside? A lot of people will put a downside target, but then they get there and it doesn't hit, and all of a sudden they're like, they want to sell when really, the downside target hasn't been hit. So that is something also to remember when looking at your targets. If you need to stick to your plan. If you say, this is what I'm looking at, I have a margin of error of this, then you got to stick to that, or you're gonna fold right when you probably should have held. I do it all the time, and I try to learn from it every time because it's something that continues to happen, and it's just a human it's an emotional response. You start to get nervous. You say, oh man, the price is starting to move down. So the whole point of this is just to always make sure that you're not looking at one side. Even if you're fully long, you always have to look at the bearish side too, because that is a possibility. Going into IWM, we've got this big gap above that did try to fill on the weekly side of things 2 weeks ago, but we still have a lot of that gap above. The main thing on the weekly is this 50% retracement that really just can't be broken through at this point. It's tested it 3 different times here. Now on the daily, we can see something very similar to what we were looking at on SPY and the Qs. This big area of volume, which is our break-even zone, acted as our point of control, and you did have a bounce from this anchored VWAP from this pullback from the original bounce. So that is what held. You also have this anchored VWAP from the February 19th reversal that also held pretty well and has acted as both resistance and now support as the price drops down. You can see here, this was your initial resistance, and then if we move this over, this has now been support. So, this is something to look at into next week as well. You do have this gap above here. So if we turn on the gap snake, you actually won't catch this one because it's too small of a gap. But we are working on making these gaps bigger. So, but notice that most of these gaps are caught. But this little one is a little too small to capture. So what I do is I'll just go in and actually fill it in myself, just draw it there, and then from there you can also visualize where that gap is. So going into the last one, VIX, as far as broad markets go at least. VIX, if people were looking at the charts on VIX, everybody saw this breakout. I think it was pretty obvious. And you also had this perfect test of this previous area of resistance for the VIX in 2018, and the VIX was so elevated, this area is now support after 7 weeks of just straight downside. So, that was pretty impressive to see the price, or not the price, but just the overall level of the VIX hold here. And so this is a really crucial zone into next week. This doesn't mean that this is going to be support forever, but for now you did have quite a bounce here. Going into a few case studies for next week and even last week, GLD is one that I want to go over. GLD is one that's really interesting if you're someone who likes to trade leaders versus laggards. The reason I say this is because you can see here on the daily chart, right? We've got this ascending triangle here. Notice we have not broken out yet, but one thing that I want to mention here as well, if I move these up, Notice that these two candles look very similar. Let me decrease this a little bit. So this candle looks pretty similar to this candle right here. If we switch this over to the raindrop, you'll see something very interesting and different about these two candles. Notice when I turn on the raindrop, you'll notice that even though these look identical on the hollow candle, they look very different on the raindrop. You can see a lot of that volume was focused more at the top of the 50% range of this daily candle, rather than here. You didn't really have a lot of volume supporting any type of price up here. It was mostly kind of right in the middle, and mostly actually in the second half of the period, or second half of the day in this case, the volume weighted average price was lower than the first half. So here we've got pretty much the opposite. So this is really to show just the edge you can get when using raindrops, being able to see that volume flow within two different candles. These two candles look identical, but when you turn on the raindrop, you've got a different view here, and you can see these little chunks here, that's the volume profile. So it's telling us that there were buyers that came in and absorbed some supply above this 50% area on the range, and you can see that, you can't see anything in that wick, but in the wick here you can see that there were buyers that came in and absorbed that supply that was put on the market, which ultimately did close the price a little lower. But remember, you can always have prices drop on low volume into close, like what happens, and it happens a lot. So this is something that I wanted to mention. But the other thing that I wanted to mention here, if we put these back and we look at this ascending triangle, let me put these back here and then here. So you'll see that if we look at the ascending triangle now, we do have a little of that volume poking above this resistance. If we go to GDX, you'll see that this move has already really happened. We already have the breakout here. You can see that if we anchor the volume profile from the bottom of this reversal candle, you'll also see that there's a huge volume shelf that was created. So this gave the price a base to bounce off of, and then you've got that breakout. So is GLD lagging GDX? Are we going to see a continuation into next week? Who knows? We'll have to see. But if we do go to the hollow candle and look at the weekly chart, you will see that this has broken out of quite a longer term area of resistance going back from 2013. And if we go to GLD and we draw something similar, notice that we haven't necessarily broken through that resistance zone yet that we had in 2013, which is here. So is GLD lagging? Possibly. If you just use trendline resistance is pretty much in confluence with this horizontal area right around 172, 175, whatever that would be. Just based on the news, the $3 trillion bill that got passed, I can't see that being a bad thing for gold or silver into next week, but you never know. It's the market, and it can throw you anything. Actually, speaking of silver, I wanted to go over a case study last week on silver. This is one that I personally made a trade on. I mentioned this in the video Tuesday. And remember, guys, we wanna mention stuff that we trade, because if we're making these videos and we're trying to, show you guys the value of the software, telling you guys theories isn't going to do anything. It's a lot easier to tell someone, hey, I made this trade and this is why, and make it a real life situation rather than just telling you guys a bunch of theories. So this is one. I saw that we had this big area of demand. We had this huge volume gap here, and this was a volume gap not only shown by this anchored volume by price. And remember, we anchored the volume by price from this reversal on February 24th. Since this time, most of the volume was holding in this area. So if you guys remember the SPY chart, we were kind of slowly trying to be this candle right here on SPY, because we were kind of breaking out of that break-even zone. I have this as a demand zone right now. That's because the price is way up here. So if the price got back down, this is the demand zone. Now, when the price is here, this is kind of your break-even zone, because everyone is break-even right here. So as the price moved up, we filled the price gap, and now we've got this next layer of holders who bought over here. And how do we know that this volume chunk is from this? Because the price has not been to this area since March, late February, early March. So we know all this volume came from this chunk of price action. So now this is the supply zone above. This will act as initially possibly resistance. You never know. If you look at the silver chart, this thing absolutely can rip and just continue to rip. And then if you look at this this weekly chart, you can also see with the MACD, this thing definitely has shown a pattern that has formed in the past. You can back test this easily. I'm not going to do it now just because I don't want to bore you guys forever with this video, but just go to the strategy tester and you can type in anything here. You can type in, your condition, indicator, do the MACD fast, and then you can choose the MACD slow. Let's just do it. Might as well. MACD fast, crossed up through the indicator slow. We want to back test that on the weekly chart. And if we see that on the chart, you'll see here, this is our entry long because this is where we crossed. Here's our entry long, excuse me, a little over here, just because this is where we actually crossed. But remember, sometimes the cross, as you can see here, you already kind of missed the move. So the MACD, just because it's crossing doesn't always mean it's going to continue up. One of the things that I like to look for is more when the MACD is starting to curl. The cross sometimes will not necessarily always do exactly what you think it's going to do. Now, notice here, the MACD cross, your entry was here, and after 5 weeks, this was a loss. But if you were looking more at when the actual fast was starting to curl up, meaning that the histogram was starting to move up, that's when you want to start looking at this. And this is just a great example of sometimes the MACD cross doesn't always necessarily mean there's going to be continuation. But either way, it is starting to cross here. We did have this horizontal breakout, so that is something to consider. These are all just charts into the week ahead. Please don't take these as advice or any type of buy-sell indicator or whatever that you would consider this. But like I said, we do want to show our customers that you can actually use the platform to do what we talk about. We can come up with theories all day about how to use stuff, but at the end of the day, we do want to share some of these trades. So I did trade this, what was this, Friday, yesterday, so it's Saturday today. And what I was doing was I was watching the raindrop here, and this is the anchored VWAP from this earnings. And so you can see here that essentially when we did break out through this zone, the raindrop was showing there was definitely buyers supporting the price above this line. So as we kind of caught a bid right at this area, notice that we broke through and then this area acted as support before continuing up. Notice you could see in the raindrop a lot of that volume supporting price on the upside move. And of course, we did have this blue raindrop forming as well, which can be used as either a trend continuation pattern or a reversal pattern. In this case, since we just broke through the anchored VWAP, it was a nice signal for continuation. And then if we go to, let's say, the daily chart, you'll see that this did really break through some interesting areas. And we now have to anchor the VWAP from this point, which is the ultimate high back in early December, at least for the most recent price action. And so if the price continued up, this area, let's say around 114, would be an interesting area for the price to break through or possibly catch some supply up there, because that is now where the average price per share has been traded since this point in time, which was really quite the big reversal. If you look at it, we were in this uptrend for quite some time. This was finally the top. And so we want to know, what is the average price per share traded since this point in time right here. And you can see this price is right at 115. So that is Disney. The last one I want to go over is ATVI. Something very similar. I was trading this one on Friday. And this candle was really fascinating to watch because you could see a lot of that volume supporting price up here, but then the wick with the candle showed that it looked like sellers came in and pushed the price down, which they did. But we know that when the price moved up, there were buyers that came in and absorbed all of that supply up here that was pretty much driving the price down. So this had a nice continuation up afterwards. You can see now if we use the horizontal area right here, just as a kind of line of best fit, notice that there is volume above this resistance line now. So that would also be something to watch into next week, just from a candlestick versus raindrop perspective. I know this was a lot of information. Thank you so much for listening into it all. And we will have our podcast, or excuse me, our stream as well tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern. So make sure to check that out on our YouTube channel. Make sure to subscribe and like this if you did enjoy watching this and learning about raindrops and different features on the platform. So, have a great weekend. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out or comment below and we'll get back to you. Thanks so much and have a great weekend.